Hello guys. Tonight we begin with a topic the ancient Egyptians took very seriously, and sometimes very strangely, sex. From sacred rituals to surprisingly frank poetry, this civilization was more open, creative, and frankly experimental than most people today might be after 2 glasses of wine and a horoscope reading. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The Egyptians did not treat sex like a scandal. They treated it like plumbing, necessary, functional, and ideally without too many blockages. In ancient Egyptian society, sex was not hidden behind closed doors, hushed whispers, or uncomfortable euphemisms. It was part of nature, like the sun rising, the Nile flooding, or cats doing whatever they wanted. The gods engaged in it. The farmers engaged in it. The nobles engaged in it. And most importantly, no one felt the need to invent shame about it. The culture did not frame sexuality as something dirty or dangerous. In fact, it was sacred, tied to creation, fertility, health, and personal pleasure, not necessarily in that order. This was not hedonism, it was balance. Egyptian society ran on the principle of ma'at, cosmic harmony, and sexuality was simply part of maintaining that harmony. Fertility meant crops, crops meant food, and food meant survival. So if your sex life was healthy, the gods were probably smiling. If not, well, maybe it was time to light a candle to Hathor and consider using more honey. This open attitude filtered into every part of life: art, literature, medicine, and even architecture. Temples featured carvings of fertility gods. Homes were often built with designated private areas for intimacy. And yes, ancient architects had enough social intelligence to understand that love does not flourish next to granaries. Unlike many later societies, ancient Egypt did not obsess over celibacy or harshly punish consensual intimacy, unless it involved property disputes or someone else's spouse. There were no mass puritanical movements, no complex hierarchies based on who did or did not do with whom. Social value was not chained to private bedroom behavior. It was tied more to how much land you had, the quality of your grain harvest, and whether you kept your linen white in the sun. If you are wondering why sex was treated with such casual sacredness in ancient Egypt, you can thank the gods, who frankly set the tone by making it part of their divine job descriptions. Let us begin with Adam, the original solo act. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Adam created the world by engaging in an act of, let us say, enthusiastic self-involvement. No partner, no help, just pure determination and cosmic alone time. From this he produced Shu and Tefnut, which means the Egyptian universe literally began with a one-god performance and bodily fluids. This was not scandalous, it was revered. Adam's generative act was seen as a divine assertion that life begins with desire. No need for fig leaves or awkward silence. The gods did not blush. Why should anyone else? Then there was Osiris and Isis, ancient Egypt's royal couple. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis, determined and extraordinarily devoted, reassembled his body. All of it. Well, almost all. One crucial part was missing, so she crafted a substitute phallus. Yes, she used magic, revived him briefly, and conceived Horus. The divine bloodline continued. That is love, and excellent time management. There was also Min, a god of fertility and male potency. He was often depicted standing tall in every sense, crowned with lettuce, and holding his most unmistakable feature proudly in hand. Ancient statues left little to the imagination. Shrines to Min featured ritual lettuce offerings, symbolizing fertility. Lettuce, it turns out, was their version of herbal vitality. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joyful intoxication, was another central figure. Often portrayed nude or semi-nude, she embodied everything pleasurable about human connection: dancing, desire, laughter, and seduction. Festivals in her honor were, essentially, ancient matchmaking gatherings with tambourines. Even the sun god Ra had moments of generative importance, though his creations usually involved speaking things into existence or spitting them out, which is only slightly less unconventional than Adam's solo debut. The gods modeled sexuality as divine, essential, and occasionally whimsical. They did not separate the sacred from the sensual. They blended them. Of course, not every Egyptian was crafting magical phalluses or leaving ritual vegetables for fertility gods. Most were just ordinary people with ordinary relationships, trying to find time for affection between herding goats and avoiding crocodiles. Unlike their mythic gods and sometimes overly affectionate royalty, the average Egyptian's love life was down to earth. If you were a farmer, a potter, or a linen weaver, your romantic opportunities probably revolved around who lived nearby, who brewed excellent beer, and who still had most of their teeth. Modest expectations, perhaps, but entirely sensible. Relationships were built on shared labor, shared meals, and ideally, shared affection. Couples often slept in the same bed, raised children together, and even snuck love notes onto broken pieces of pottery. Yes, actual pottery shards inscribed with heartfelt lines like, "I dream of your beauty by night." That was ancient texting. Sex was not regulated by priests or dictated by political law. As long as it was consensual and did not violate someone else's marriage agreement or disrupt your work duties, it was considered your private matter. Privacy might have been scarce. Walls were thin, and nosy neighbors were as timeless as the pyramids, but intimacy was respected. Tomb paintings sometimes showed couples holding hands, touching foreheads, or standing tenderly side by side, not for symbolism, but to capture real emotional closeness. Timing mattered too. Fertility aligned with the cycles of the Nile and the seasons. Women tracked their bodies. Men used herbal tonics. And everyone knew at least one elder who swore by strange folk remedies involving onions and honey. Contraception, while imperfect, was known. So was midwifery. There were even pregnancy tests, ones that involved barley and emmer seeds. If they sprouted after being urinated on, congratulations. If not, perhaps next season. And if love did not work out, divorce was possible. There were no dramatic public trials, no ritual shame, just a division of assets and a return to separate bread ovens. If you imagine ancient Egyptian weddings filled with veils, bouquets, and awkward relatives doing ceremonial dances, scale that image back. Weddings were minimalist affairs. If two people agreed to live together and share food, bedding, and possibly a goat, then society accepted them as married. That was it. No ceremony, no priest, no 47-dish catering service. No need for matching outfits, just linen. White, breathable, and practical. Some couples drafted marriage contracts, essentially ancient prenuptial agreements. These outlined what each person brought into the household and what would happen if things fell apart. Sometimes they even included specific penalties for bad behavior, like if you strike me, you owe me silver. Not poetic, perhaps, but extremely clear. These contracts also reflected the significant rights women held in Egyptian society. Women could own land, initiate divorce, and take legal action against ex-husbands. If love was blind, Egyptian law certainly was not. There was no concept of a honeymoon, unless you count collapsing after a feast and hoping the neighbors did not hear. Still, affection, closeness, and cooperation were deeply valued. Marriage was not merely a social contract, it was a personal partnership, ideally grounded in mutual respect. Let us get this out of the way. Ancient Egyptians valued fidelity, especially in principle. In daily practice, however, things could be more nuanced, especially among the powerful, the wealthy, or those with particularly creative justifications. Adultery was not always considered a crime. For most ordinary people, it was more a matter of reputation than law. Still, the expectation of loyalty persisted, woven into the broader cultural fabric that valued balance and mutual obligation. If you got caught cheating, people would talk loudly and probably in verse. But unless someone's livestock or inheritance was directly affected, the government was not rushing in to punish your escapades. However, if you were a married woman caught in adultery, the consequences could be harsher, socially and economically, if not legally. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not aggressively so, and a woman's fidelity was often tied to questions of paternity, inheritance, and her general standing as someone who did not cause chaos during harvest season. Accusations of infidelity could lead to divorce, public shame, and, in rare cases, punishment such as beatings or banishment, particularly in elite households where family honor was treated like a full-time profession. Men, meanwhile, had more flexibility. A married man who slept with an unmarried woman might be met with nothing more than a shrug. A married man with another married woman, now that was a different matter entirely, especially if the other husband was important and not fond of sharing. Jealousy, it seems, has never been confined to any particular century. Texts from the New Kingdom mention moral expectations and the importance of reputation. In some stories, adulterers are portrayed as foolish or dishonorable. In others, a man who sleeps with another man's wife is doomed to a tragic fate, often involving curses, impotence, or divine retribution from a particularly unforgiving jackal-headed god. Yet the absence of strict legal penalties for adultery in many periods is telling. The Egyptians did not feel compelled to legislate every indiscretion. Instead, they relied on public shame, persistent gossip, and the occasional passive-aggressive song lyric. This system worked about as well as one might expect. If a marriage ended due to infidelity, the divorce process was not complex. Property would be divided, and the community would collectively pretend they were not watching with deep curiosity. Children usually stayed with the mother, particularly if they were still young. If your first reaction to hearing that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters is a horrified, "Wait, what?" you are not alone. Most modern humans respond in the same way. But in ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty was not only tolerated, it was expected. Romantic? Not especially. Political? Absolutely. To understand this eyebrow-raising tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your lineage is descended from gods, not symbolically, but literally. If divine beings married their siblings to uphold cosmic order, then surely the royal family should do the same. Because nothing says stability like a wedding that doubles as a very awkward family reunion. This practice had little to do with desire and everything to do with power. Pharaohs wanted to prevent outsiders, even other nobles, from accessing the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline undiluted and the property in-house. In essence, royal Egypt operated on a blend of divine mythology and dynastic trust issues. Some of the most iconic rulers followed this tradition. Tutankhamun, for example, was the product of a brother-sister union, a fact confirmed by modern DNA testing. Unfortunately, the results were not ideal. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple congenital conditions, including a clubfoot, and a weakened immune system, suggesting that repeatedly folding the family tree could have its drawbacks. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians were not partaking in this royal custom. Common people married outside their immediate families, as most rational individuals do. Cousin marriage occasionally occurred in rural regions, but full sibling unions were strictly reserved for those with burial boats and golden masks. Even among royalty, the tradition had its challenges. When Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra, took the throne, She technically married her brothers, as custom dictated. However, she largely ruled alone and later aligned herself with men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who, thankfully, were not related to her. To us, the whole notion seems bizarre and medically unwise. But to the ancient elite, it was sacred tradition wrapped in divine logic. The bloodline had to remain godly, even at the expense of genetic diversity. If you think all Egyptian art was limited to solemn statues, rigid postures, and endless profile views, then you have never encountered the Turin Erotic Papyrus. That particular scroll makes it clear the Egyptians had humor, and they had very detailed anatomical interests. While most Egyptian artwork is known for restraint, serene gods, symmetrical faces, and stoic figures, the culture was not immune to playful expression. Sex was not taboo, and occasionally the artists took a break from carving falcons to sketch something a bit more animated. The most famous example of this genre is the Turin Erotic Papyrus, now housed discreetly in an Italian museum. Believed to have been created around 1150 BCE, it contains explicit scenes, not subtle allusions or mythic symbols, but direct, unmistakable illustrations. One image even shows a man balancing on an amphora in a manner that scholars debate is either symbolic or simply acrobatic bragging. The purpose of the scroll is still under discussion. Some believe it was satire or light-hearted erotica, perhaps even a gift to amuse someone with eccentric taste. Others argue it was a parody, mocking the cultural obsession with fertility, virility, and oversized wigs. Aside from this unique piece, most Egyptian erotic art leaned toward the symbolic. Temples did not host murals reminiscent of the Kama Sutra. Instead, they included fertility symbols, sacred nudes, and figures like Hathor and Min portrayed in reverent ways. Min, for instance, was always depicted, shall we say, upright, holding his unmistakable symbol with the confidence of a fertility god who knew his role. Beyond the temples, there were also humorous marginal drawings, animals acting like humans, exaggerated flirtations, and doodles etched on ostraca, the limestone flakes that served as ancient sticky notes. Erotic imagery in Egyptian art was not meant to shock or scandalize. It was just another thread in the fabric of life, sometimes ritualized, sometimes exaggerated, and often refreshingly honest. Now, if your mental image of ancient love poetry involves awkward metaphors like "your beauty is like a grain silo," think again. The Egyptians may have carved hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but stiff. These poets understood affection. They expressed it with flair, directness, and occasionally a complete disregard for subtlety. Their words were preserved on papyrus and bits of pottery, because nothing says romance like a reused cereal bowl. Most surviving love poems date to the New Kingdom period around 1300 CE, and they are surprisingly passionate, deeply honest, and occasionally steamy enough to make you wonder what was in the Nile water. Consider this line from one such poem: "I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me, and if you come near me, I will get better." This is not passive admiration. This is flirtation with a solid strategy. Both men and women authored these works, often writing in the first person, which is remarkably rare for the ancient world. A young woman might describe the thrill of watching her beloved across the lotus pond. A young man could sing the praises of her voice, claiming it sweeter than beer, which, in that time, was the highest form of praise. These poems were not hidden in private journals. They were read aloud at banquets, shared during gatherings, and used as clever tools of courtship. Imagine a date where someone recites a heartfelt stanza between harp solos, followed by wine and perhaps a well-cooked goat. Their metaphors were lush and earthy. Fruit symbolized passion, hunting represented pursuit, and gardens were frequently about more than vegetables. Egyptian love poetry balanced grounded affection with celestial adoration. Desire was not to be hidden. It was to be spoken, celebrated, and remembered, even if your cousin read it a little too slowly at family gatherings. When you think of aphrodisiacs, you probably imagine oysters, chocolate, or wine, not salad. If you got caught cheating, people would talk loudly and probably in verse. But unless someone's livestock or inheritance was directly affected, the government was not rushing in to punish your escapades. However, if you were a married woman caught in adultery, the consequences could be harsher socially and economically, if not legally. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not aggressively so. A woman's fidelity was often tied to questions of paternity, inheritance, and her general standing as someone who did not cause chaos during harvest season. Accusations of infidelity could lead to divorce, public shame, and in rare cases, punishment such as beatings or banishment, particularly in elite households where family honor was a full-time occupation. Men, meanwhile, had more flexibility. A married man sleeping with an unmarried woman was mostly shrugged off. A married man with another married woman, however, that was much messier, especially if the other husband was important and not interested in sharing. Jealousy has never been confined to any one century. Texts from the New Kingdom mention moral expectations and the importance of maintaining a good reputation. In some stories, adulterers are described as foolish or dishonorable, while others suggest that a man who sleeps with another man's wife will meet a tragic fate, usually involving curses, impotence, or angry gods with jackal heads. Still, the absence of strict laws against adultery in most periods is telling. The Egyptians did not feel the need to legislate every affair. They relied more on shame, gossip, and the occasional passive-aggressive song lyric. It worked about as well as you might expect. If a marriage broke down due to infidelity, the divorce process was not overly complicated. Property would be split, and the community would collectively pretend they were not watching with interest. Children typically stayed with the mother, especially if they were young. If your first reaction to hearing that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters is a horrified, "Wait, what?" you are not alone. Most modern humans respond the same way. But in ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty was not just tolerated, it was expected. Romantic? Not really. Political? Absolutely. To understand this eyebrow-raising tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your family is descended from gods, not in a metaphorical divine right way, but literally. If the gods married their siblings to maintain cosmic order, then obviously the royal family should do the same. Because nothing says eternal stability, like awkward family reunions, that double as wedding receptions. This was not about attraction. It was about consolidating power. Pharaohs did not want outsiders, even noble ones, gaining access to the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the assets in-house. Essentially, royal Egypt ran on a combination of divine mythology and dynastic trust issues. Some of the most famous pharaohs followed this tradition. Tutankhamun, for example, was born from a brother-sister union, a fact confirmed by modern DNA. And spoiler alert, it did not turn out great. Tut had numerous congenital issues, including a clubfoot and a fragile immune system, which might suggest that repeating the family tree too many times comes with consequences. Meanwhile, commoners were not partaking in this trend. Most regular Egyptians married outside their immediate families like sane, functioning people. Cousin marriage occasionally happened in rural areas, but brother-sister unions were strictly for the folks with gold masks and burial boats. Even among royals, the practice could cause problems. When Cleopatra, that Cleopatra took the throne, she technically married her brothers, plural, as per custom. But she ruled largely alone, and later aligned herself with men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who were not, thankfully, related to her. To us, the whole concept seems bizarre, and yes, medically unwise. But to the ancient Egyptian elite, it was simply tradition wrapped in God-complex logic. Divine bloodlines had to stay divine, even if it meant sacrificing variety in the royal gene pool. If you assume all ancient Egyptian art was solemn statues, stiff postures, and endless profile views, you are technically right unless you have seen the Turin erotic papyrus. Then you realize, oh, they had jokes and very detailed anatomy. While Egyptian art is mostly known for its restrained stoic pharaohs, serene gods, perfectly symmetrical profile faces, the culture was not immune to cheekiness. Sex, after all, was not taboo. So occasionally, the artist stopped carving falcons and started sketching something a bit more animated. The most infamous example is that Turin papyrus, now tucked away in an Italian museum like a naughty secret. It is believed to date to around 1150 BCE, and it contains explicit scenes, not vague mythological winks. We are talking graphic illustrations of men and women, including one gentleman balancing acrobatically on an amphora, which is either symbolic or just showing off. Scholars debate whether it was satire, erotica, or a combination of both. Some think it was made to entertain, possibly even a bachelor's gift for someone with questionable taste. Others suggest it was a parody and artistic prank, poking fun at how obsessed people were with fertility, virility, and large wigs. Aside from this outlier, most Egyptian erotic art was symbolic, not explicit. Temples did not have Kama Sutra frescoes. They had fertility motifs, sacred imagery, and occasional nudes representing rebirth, creation, or divine femininity. Goddesses like Hathor and fertility deities like Min were often shown nude, but in a reverent way. Min, for instance, is always depicted standing tall if you catch the drift holding his signature symbol like a divine badge of honor. Then there is the use of humor and sexuality in marginal drawings, animals behaving like people, exaggerated gestures, and flirty little side sketches on workers' ostraka, limestone flakes used like sticky notes, the ancient equivalent of doodling in your notebook when the foreman was not looking. Eroticism in Egyptian art was not meant to scandalize. It was simply another part of life, occasionally celebrated, often ritualized, and sometimes hilariously over the top. These were not repressed people. They just had an excellent sense of boundaries, and occasionally, a day where they decided the scroll needed spice. If your idea of ancient love poetry is stiff chiseled metaphors, like your beauty is like a grain silo, think again. The Egyptians may have carved hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but rigid. These people knew how to flirt with ink, with style, and occasionally with absolutely no chill. Preserved on papyri and broken pottery shards, because nothing says eternal love like a reused cereal bowl. Egyptian love poems date mostly to the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE, and they are refreshingly honest, surprisingly passionate, and occasionally so steamy you would think they were written during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. Here is a genuine line from one. I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me, and if you come near me, I will get better. This is not vague romanticism. This is flirtation with a plan. Both men and women compose these poems, often from a first-person perspective that is rare for the ancient world. In Egypt, a young woman could describe the thrill of sneaking glances across the lotus pond. A young man could wax poetic about how her voice was better than beer. That is the kind of devotion that deserves a monument. These were not private diary entries, either. Some were performed at banquets, read aloud for entertainment, courtship, or just to fill awkward silences between harp solos. Imagine ancient Tinder dates with live readings of passionate stanzas, followed by wine and maybe a goat roast. And the metaphors, they went all in. Fruit symbolized sensuality. Hunting meant pursuit and seduction. Gardens and rivers were, well, not always about agriculture. These poems were not afraid to mix earthy, grounded affection with cosmic-level adoration. Desire was not something to be repressed. It was to be sung about, written down, and possibly recited by that one cousin who always read too slowly. But in ancient Egypt, if someone brought you a bouquet of lettuce, they were not thinking about fiber. They were flirting. Specifically, they were invoking the power of Min, the Egyptian god of fertility, who, for reasons that are equal parts symbolic and suspicious, was closely associated with Roma lettuce. Yes, Rama, not just your average Caesar garnish. This stuff was sacred. The reason? Well, unlike the floppy-leafed varieties we toss in sad lunch bowls today, Egyptian lettuce stood upright and oozed a milky white sap when cut. And if that did not trigger some highly suggestive divine symbolism, nothing would. Ancient priests looked at that and thought, now that is clearly the embodiment of male potency. Naturally, lettuce was regularly offered to Min during fertility rituals. His statues typically featured him in a, let us say, alert state, holding his signature attribute in one hand and a lettuce stalk in the other. Art historians have had a field day with that pairing for centuries. At fertility festivals, worshippers would present bundles of lettuce at his temple, hoping to gain his favor for increased virility, a healthy pregnancy, or just a bit of romantic luck. Min was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a dating app algorithm worship him correctly, and your chances might improve. Interestingly, there is evidence that the lettuce was also believed to have medicinal properties, particularly for promoting sexual health. Whether it actually worked, or just led to fresher breath before a date, is debatable, but the symbolism stuck. And this was not just a passing trend. Lettuce appears in art, hieroglyphics, and even offerings in tombs, as if to say, please ensure I continue enjoying pleasure in the afterlife, and maybe pack a salad. It is worth noting that the ancient Egyptians were big fans of natural symbolism. From the Nile's life-giving floods to the lotus flower's daily blooming cycle, the physical world mirrored their spiritual beliefs. So when a vegetable starts acting a little extra, you best believe it got promoted to mystical status. When it came to preventing pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians employed methods that were imaginative, herbal, and occasionally alarming. Without access to modern science, they relied on natural substances, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the earliest surviving medical documents, dating to around 1550 BCE. One of the more infamous prescriptions involved crocodile dung mixed with honey and sourdough. This concoction was inserted vaginally as a form of barrier contraceptive. While modern readers may recoil, the idea was not entirely without logic. The mixture likely created an acidic or obstructive environment. Whether it was effective is unclear. Whether it was unpleasant is easier to guess. More promising was the use of acacia gum, a plant extract that, as later science confirmed, ferments into lactic acid, a compound that does in fact have spermicidal qualities. Combined with other ingredients like honey and dates, it formed a kind of early pessary. It is one of the few ancient remedies that could arguably pass a very lenient clinical trial. These methods suggest that Egyptian women, who had notable legal and medical agency, for the time took active roles in managing reproduction. The use of these materials would have been common knowledge among midwives, healers, and women within the household. There were also ritual and spiritual approaches. Women might appeal to fertility deities like Isis, Hathor, or Bes, seeking either conception or its delay. Magical amulets and incantations were used alongside practical remedies, blurring the line between medicine and religion, as was typical in most aspects of Egyptian life. In addition to preventing pregnancy, Egyptian medical texts contain instructions for inducing menstruation, treating infertility, and even early pregnancy detection using barley and emmer, grains exposed to urine, a method surprisingly accurate in some cases. In the absence of modern tools, these practices reveal a culture deeply invested in understanding and influencing the human body. They lacked microscopes, but not intention. Fertility was a matter of life, death, economics, and divine favor. And while some of their methods may now seem outlandish, the impulse behind them, to plan, to protect, to prepare is strikingly familiar. In ancient Egypt, virginity was not a badge of honor, a social currency, or a fragile family heirloom to be guarded at all costs. In fact, it was not really a big deal at all, more like a passing footnote in the grander narrative of life, which mostly revolved around crops, inheritance, and not angering the gods before breakfast. There is no known Egyptian word for virgin in the moralistic, ceremonial sense. The closest you will find are terms that mean young woman or uninitiated, which is less purity culture and more has not had the time yet. No torches were lit, no ceremonies performed, and no mothers-in-law inspecting linens like they were looking for counterfeit currency. This was not because the Egyptians were scandalous libertines. It is just that they had a far more functional approach to sex. It was seen as part of life, like eating bread or avoiding hippos. Important, yes. Sacred, sometimes. But nothing that required a purity certificate stamped by a temple priest. For women, value came from things like fertility, loyalty, and whether she could run a household without the roof catching fire. Her sexual history? Mostly her business. Marriage was not about sealing a chaste deal. It was about forming a reliable alliance that could ideally survive tax season and plagues. Of course, modesty existed. People did not walk around advertising their conquests on papyrus scrolls. But the kind of ritual obsession with virginity found in later societies just did not materialize here. No cloistering, no dowries based on moral performance, no uncles making awkward speeches about virtue. Even Egyptian religion offered little support for the whole purity panic. The goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and wine, was openly sensual and extremely unbothered by anyone's opinions. The gods were far too busy managing creation and cosmic balance to weigh in on who had done what, when, and with whom. In the end, virginity in ancient Egypt was treated for what it is, a temporary condition, not a lifelong resume. And frankly, they seemed more concerned with who could bake good bread and whether your father had a reliable roof to offer. Because when you live in a desert surrounded by crocodiles, you learn pretty quickly what really matters and what absolutely does not. And sometimes both in the same afternoon. The ancient Egyptians approached infertility with characteristic pragmatism. Their medical papyri, particularly the Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, include detailed diagnoses, treatments, and methods for evaluating female fertility. There were instructions for examining cervical mucus, monitoring cycles, and even a primitive pregnancy test involving urinating on barley and emmer wheat. If the grains sprouted, congratulations, your household was about to get louder. If not, the next step might involve inserting herbal mixtures, fumigating the womb, yes, really, or appealing to higher powers. Because in Egypt, if medicine did not work, magic was always available and often recommended. Amulets played a central role, symbols of Hathor, Isis, Bes, or Tauret, the hippo-shaped protector of childbirth, were worn, carried, or placed under pillows. Spells were recited, figurines were buried or cradled. One text suggests that to conceive, a woman should drink a concoction of ground dates, honey, and carob while reciting a protective charm. Not FDA approved, but deeply heartfelt. Men, of course, were not off the hook. Though far fewer papyri bothered to question their reproductive contributions, in cases of persistent infertility, a man might be told to undergo purification rituals, consult a priest, or in less official advice, simply try harder. And because this was Egypt, cosmic order mat was always part of the equation. A childless couple might be seen as unbalanced or even cursed, but society did not shun them. It offered remedies, hope, and a few very creative prescriptions. It is worth noting that despite all this effort, Egyptian households were not necessarily overflowing with children. High infant mortality, disease, and malnutrition kept family sizes smaller than ideal, which only made fertility all the more sacred, and its absence all the more personal. If you think desire fades after death, the ancient Egyptians would like a word and possibly a carefully carved offering slab. In their worldview, death was not an end. It was a continuation of life, ideally with all the comforts, pleasures, and daily routines of the living world, including sex. Funerary texts, tomb inscriptions, and grave goods all suggest that the deceased hope to carry their appetites into the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but for love, touch, and intimacy. Because frankly, what is the point of eternal life if it does not include a bit of pleasure? Tomb art often depicted couples embracing, holding hands, or standing intimately close, not just for sentiment, but as a spiritual blueprint. These were not generic stock poses. They were deliberate messages to the gods. Please restore our bodies, our love, and if possible, our bedroom privileges. And yes, bodily restoration was a serious concern. In the Book of the Dead and other mortuary texts, the dead are promised their limbs will function, their hearts will be weighed fairly, and their, let us say, equipment will be returned intact. There are even references to revivifying certain parts of the anatomy. No detail was considered too personal for eternity. Sexuality was tied to rebirth. The god Osiris, famously dismembered and reassembled by Isis, was revived, including a reconstructed phallus, before fathering Horus. This myth was not just legend, it was a template. If the gods resumed intimacy after resurrection, so should the rest of us. Some tomb inscriptions even included requests to the gods for continued love between husband and wife in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. It was envisioned as a lush, idealized version of earthly life. Fertile land, calm waters, eternal abundance, and evidently room for romance. While modern cultures often compartmentalize sex as earthly and mortal, the Egyptians folded it seamlessly into their afterlife ideology. It was not shameful or forgotten. It was another part of the soul's well-being, like food, music, and not having to pay taxes ever again. In the end, they hoped for what most people still do: comfort, companionship, and a little joy, even if it took mummification and a few magical scrolls to get there. When we peel back the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt metaphorically, of course, what we find is a civilization that did not treat the human body as something shameful, sinful, or suspicious. It was seen as natural, powerful, and capable of both divine creation and very human desire. Sex, for the Egyptians, was not a secret to be hidden. It was a fact of life, discussed in poems, depicted in art, sometimes vividly, and written into the very myths that shaped their worldview. Gods themselves fell in love, flirted, seduced, and occasionally caused fertility-related chaos across the Nile. In a culture where existence flowed from cycles, the flooding of the river, the return of the sun, the rebirth of the soul, sexuality was part of that rhythm, not an interruption of it. They also took a practical approach, from contraception and fertility treatments to love songs and afterlife desires. The Egyptians faced physicality head-on, often with more clarity than many societies that came centuries later. There was no hysterical legislation, no moral panic, no need for uncomfortable censorship scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. Just a clear understanding. Bodies do things, people feel things, and the world keeps turning. Importantly, they did not overthink it. Sex was not put on a pedestal, nor was it dragged through the mud. It was part of health, love, family, and sometimes religion, worthy of respect, but not surrounded by neurosis. Even their gods, powerful and eternal, did not shy away from physical form or intimacy. In fact, they embodied it. And while not every practice holds up today, we are looking at you, crocodile dung the attitude remains refreshingly modern. Or perhaps modernity has just taken 3,000 years to catch up. And maybe that is the legacy worth remembering, a culture that did not fear the body, did not vilify desire, and somehow still managed to build pyramids on top of it all. It was August 24th, 1814, and Washington, D.C. was burning. Columns of smoke choked the night sky as British soldiers torched the most symbolic buildings in the young republic: the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Office, and the President's mansion, later to be called the White House. Flames licked the rooftops as the redcoats walked through the city almost casually, facing no organized resistance. The Capitol, barely a teenager in political years, was defenseless. The humiliation was complete. The world watched in disbelief, and America blushed with shame. But to understand how things got this bad, you have to rewind a bit. And smoke blackened the dome of the Capitol. America had to ask itself a painful question. Had they underestimated the empire they once defied? The British did not simply appear in Washington by magic. Their road to the Capitol was shockingly easy, because the Americans, through confusion and disorganization, had practically opened the door for them. Their landing point was Benedict, Maryland, a sleepy little town nestled by the quiet waters of the Patuxent River. From there, seasoned British Major General Robert Ross led approximately 4,500 disciplined troops, many of whom were veterans fresh from the intense and complex Napoleonic Wars. They began their march toward Washington. And yet, it was not a desperate, contested push through enemy territory. No, it felt more like a relaxed Sunday hike through quiet countryside. The reason? The Americans barely made an effort to halt them. President James Madison and his government were fully aware that the British were coming. They had received time to prepare, with warnings pouring in from scouts, informants, and even concerned civilians. But bureaucracy, indecision, and a dangerous undercurrent of wishful thinking all led to a defense that was sluggish and chaotic at best. Secretary of War John Armstrong, Jr., in an almost surreal display of denial, repeatedly insisted the British would not attack Washington. He declared, "They will go for Baltimore." But they did not. Brigadier General William Winder was tasked with organizing the city's defense. Sadly, Winder was more suited to writing meticulous reports than to leading troops in battle. His defense forces were hastily assembled, consisting mainly of militiamen, many of them untrained, undisciplined, and reportedly, in some cases, under the influence of alcohol. The professional soldiers he did command were too few in number. Worse yet, Winder hesitated repeatedly, pulling back and failing to fortify key positions, unsure of where the British would strike. Eventually, on August 24th, the two forces met at the Battle of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. On paper, American forces actually outnumbered the British, but numbers did not matter that day. The battle quickly turned into a disastrous failure. Militiamen fled before they even fired a single shot. Some dropped their weapons entirely and ran. President Madison was briefly present on the field himself, but soon wisely chose not to die alongside the ill-prepared. The British, almost surprised by how easily they prevailed, pressed forward. There were no trenches to overcome, no flaming barricades to dismantle, and no desperate defense of the Capitol to stop them. It was a nearly unopposed advance into the heart of Washington, a comedy of errors, though no one was laughing. By the time British troops reached the city, the American leadership had dissolved into chaos. Madison had fled, and government officials were hurriedly loading important documents into carts. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to leave without dignity, packed up precious valuables, including the now famous portrait of George Washington, painted by Gilbert Stuart. As night fell, British forces marched into a ghost town. Washington was nearly deserted. The streets were quiet, eerily quiet. The only sounds to be heard were the firm steps of British boots and the soft, unsettling crackle of fires from earlier clashes. Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn led their men with military precision. There was no looting, no wild chaos, just a calm, focused mission with a singular intent: to make a statement. And what a statement it was. The British began with the Capitol building. Though still under construction, its north and south wings, home to the chambers of Congress, stood complete enough to represent the spirit of American governance. The British set fire to both wings. Flames consumed the Library of Congress, incinerating rare books and manuscripts, some of which were irreplaceable. It was more than a military act, it was a cultural wound. Next, they moved to the President's Mansion, as it was then called. Dolly Madison had already fled, having saved national treasures, but the house still bore the marks of life. A dinner had been laid out, untouched on the table. British officers, perhaps bemused by the surreal scene, reportedly sat and ate before setting the building ablaze. Their actions were measured, almost ceremonial. Admiral Cockburn, feeling personally mocked by American political cartoons, ensured the destruction of anti-British newspapers' offices. He reportedly climbed atop the Speaker's chair in the House of Representatives and mocked, "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned? Oh yes, it shall." For 2 days, fire consumed Washington. The Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, the Arsenal all went up in flames. Even the bridge across the Potomac was destroyed to prevent counterattacks. Yet not everything was lost. The Patent Office was spared, thanks to one man, William Thornton. He convinced the British that it belonged not only to the U.S. government, but to all of mankind. The British destruction was precise, calculated. They had no plans to conquer the capital. Their goal was to shame it. And with every building that collapsed in a plume of smoke, their message grew louder. This was punishment, not conquest. Then, something strange and unexpected happened. As the British settled into their destructive conquest, the sky suddenly darkened. Winds began to rise, then thunder. A wild and violent storm, what some would later call a hurricane, descended on the city. It was as though nature itself had decided the destruction had gone far enough. Rain poured, torrential and relentless, dousing many of the fires that had consumed the city. Wind ripped through buildings, pulling off roofs and sending cannons tumbling. One British soldier was reportedly killed by debris flung violently through the air. The storm's power was so sudden, so overwhelming, that British officers began to whisper about divine judgment. Some believed they were being punished for destroying a defenseless city. And then, as if summoned from the heavens, a tornado tore directly through the heart of the capital. A literal tornado. Yes, it ripped carts from the ground and splintered trees like twigs. Buildings that had survived the fires now crumbled under nature's wrath. British soldiers were thrown to the ground, shaken and stunned. Already preparing to leave, the British command saw the storm as a clear sign. Their message had been delivered. To linger would be to tempt fate. They pulled out the next day. Their boots were still damp from the storm. For Washington, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. It added to the physical destruction, yes, but it also helped extinguish the flames. It may have saved the capital from complete annihilation. It washed away the invaders, literally and symbolically. In the minds of many Americans, the storm became something more than weather. It was divine intervention. Editorials declared it the hand of providence. Preachers proclaimed it an act of God. Even seasoned soldiers whispered that some higher force had stepped in to protect the nation when men could not. Of course, nature does not take sides. The storm did not rebuild what was lost, but it gave the nation something powerful, a sense that not all hope was gone. The fires were out. The British had left. And though the city was wet, broken, and humiliated, it was still American. The worst was over, but the rebuilding of a shaken nation had only just begun. In fact, it was just beginning. Out of that destruction came a collective refusal to be defined by loss. The reconstruction of Washington was not merely about bricks and mortar. It was a profound act of defiance, memory, and renewal. The new capital, along with the White House, would rise not just as buildings, but as architectural symbols of national endurance. The very act of rebuilding sent a clear political message to the world. We are still here, and it worked. Though the war may have ended in a stalemate on paper, in the American imagination, it became something far greater. The idea that a young, disorganized republic could stand up to the world's greatest empire, get burned, battered, yet never broken, began to solidify a deep sense of exceptionalism. The War of 1812, and especially the burning of the Capitol, marked a kind of coming-of-age moment for the United States. It also forced change. The government began to take defense more seriously. Fortifications along the coasts were improved, and the military, long neglected since the Revolution, received better funding and a more strategic organization. Civilians, too, began to see themselves differently, no longer as scattered citizens of isolated states, but as participants in a shared national experiment. Culturally, the flames left an indelible mark. Francis Scott Key's poem, inspired by the defense of Baltimore, would become the national anthem. More than a century later, the term White House, born from post-fire renovations, became permanent. Dolly Madison's bravery became legend, and the city that once seemed a failed compromise transformed into the unquestioned heart of the nation. Even the British, with time, came to treat the event with a kind of embarrassed quiet. They had succeeded militarily, but arguably failed diplomatically. Their fire may have burned the walls, but it could not burn the American will. In the end, the burning of Washington was not just a low point. It was the spark that tested and proved the durability of a republic still learning how to stand. And that fire, once meant to humiliate, helped forge the American spirit in flame. They didn't just mourn their children, they fought for them with everything they had. The emotional toll was enormous. There were no therapists, no mourning leave, no grief counselors. A mother might lose a baby on Monday and return to her chores on Tuesday. The fields needed plowing, the fire needed stoking. Life moved forward whether your heart was ready or not. In medieval motherhood, hope and heartbreak lived side by side. Every birth was a miracle, every survival a small defiance against the crushing odds. For noble women, motherhood wasn't just personal, it was political. A noble woman's womb was an asset of the crown, a vessel for alliances, dynasties, and succession plans. Her pregnancies were tracked with more intensity than most medieval wars, and every child, especially a son, was a strategic victory or a public failure. The pressure was immense. From the moment of marriage, a noble woman's sole duty was to produce heirs, not just any children, but legitimate, healthy male children. A queen who failed to do so risked being cast aside. Kings might seek annulments, mistresses, or even new wives altogether. Just ask Anne of Bohemia or Catherine of Aragon. A barren noblewoman wasn't just pitied. She was politically useless. Even when children were born, the mother's work wasn't done. Her role became one of anxious oversight. She didn't necessarily raise the children herself. Wet nurses, governesses, and tutors were typically responsible for daily care, but she was expected to manage their education, secure their futures, and guard their reputations like a hawk. Mothers of future kings often endured endless court gossip, factional intrigue, and manipulation. Their sons were pawns before they could walk, betrothed before they could speak, and daughters were marriage chips, often sent to foreign courts as teenagers, sometimes never to return. Still, noble mothers weren't always distant or decorative. Some wielded enormous influence through their children. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just birth kings. She advised them, corrected them, and in one case rebelled against one. Margaret of Anjou led armies to defend her son's throne. Isabella of France orchestrated the deposition of her husband in her son's name. These were not passive mothers. These were political operatives disguised in velvet and lace. Motherhood also came with heartbreak. Stillbirths, disease, assassinations, and exile meant royal children were far from safe. The higher the rank, the deadlier the game. Emotionally, noble mothers lived in constant tension. They had status, but not always agency. Love for their children was real, but often tangled with duty. They were expected to sacrifice their bodies, their privacy, and even their maternal instincts for the good of their house. If noble women bore the weight of dynasties, peasant mothers carried the full burden of survival, raw, relentless, and unromantic. For the medieval peasant woman, motherhood wasn't a stage of life, it was life itself. It began young, ended late, and rarely offered rest in between. These women typically married in their mid-teens and were pregnant almost constantly through their 20s and 30s. With no access to reliable birth control, and with the church staunchly condemning any form of contraception, pregnancy was a near constant state. Each child born was another mouth to feed, but also potentially another pair of hands to work the land. Peasant women gave birth at home, no doctors, no clean linens, no privacy. A neighbor midwife might assist or not. Some women gave birth alone in barns or fields, returned to laboring within hours, and hoped not to bleed out under the sky. Death during or after childbirth wasn't uncommon, and no one issued apologies for it. Life was cruel, fast, and unsentimental. Childrearing began the moment the umbilical cord was cut. There was no such thing as maternity leave. Infants were swaddled tightly and either carried on the mother's body while she worked or left in cradles near half-fires, supervised by older siblings or none at all. Crying wasn't coddled. It was a sound absorbed into the rhythm of daily toil. Mothers taught their children by example how to feed chickens, gather firewood, weed gardens, and patch clothes. Even toddlers were expected to fetch water or carry messages. Every child needed to contribute. Childhood, as we think of it, innocent, protected, full of toys and schooling, simply didn't exist. And yet, despite the hardship, there was affection. Mothers sang lullabies, braided their daughters' hair, whispered prayers as they tucked children beside them on shared straw beds. Love was expressed through food, through warmth, through sacrifice. A mother giving her portion of bread to a hungry child. A mother walking barefoot so her son could wear her only pair of shoes to church. Peasant motherhood was a masterclass in endurance. These women carried not just babies but burdens, firewood, expectations, and loss. Their backs bent with the weight of a world that never paused, even when they buried a child. And still, they kept going. In the medieval world, feeding a baby was a matter of both biology and hierarchy. For most mothers, especially peasants, breastfeeding was non-negotiable. It was natural, expected, and vital for survival. Formula didn't exist, and animal milk was risky and often contaminated. A mother's body was the only lifeline. Peasant mothers breastfed their babies for as long as possible, often well into toddlerhood, because they had to. Breastfeeding not only nourished the child, it also acted as a form of rudimentary birth control, slightly delaying the return of fertility and accidental mercy in a world of near-constant pregnancies. These women worked the fields with infants strapped to their backs, pausing to feed them between planting and harvesting. But in noble households, the rules changed. For upper-class women, breastfeeding was often considered beneath their station, physically draining, emotionally inconvenient, and culturally unfitting for a lady of refinement. Enter the wet nurse. These were lower-class women selected for their health and milk supply, paid to breastfeed noble infants full-time. They often lived with the child and formed deep maternal bonds, sometimes stronger than the one between mother and child. The church had mixed feelings about this. Some theologians worried that a child nursed by a morally impure woman might absorb her sins. Others believed wet nurses were a practical necessity for women who needed to remain fertile and continue producing heirs. After all, A queen could not risk wasting time nursing one child when she needed to be pregnant with the next. Infant care itself was harsh by modern standards. Swaddling was nearly universal. Babies were wrapped tightly in cloth to straighten their limbs and train them not to move too much. Diapers existed, but were often reused rags or moss-lined cloth, changed infrequently. Baths were rare. Teething was treated with charms or folk remedies. Cribs were hard if they existed at all. Babies often shared a bed with their parents, increasing the risk of accidental smothering. Sickness struck quickly. Remedies ranged from herbal infusions to prayers to saints. If a child died, especially in infancy, some believed it was God's will or worse, punishment for the mother's sins. Still, mothers did what they could. They rocked, soothed, fed, and sang lullabies in languages long lost. Love found its way even in the mud and shadows of medieval life. In medieval Europe, motherhood wasn't just physical labor. It was spiritual labor too. The church had a firm grip on the experience of pregnancy, birth, and parenting. Everything from conception to burial was soaked in religious meaning, and a mother's soul was always under scrutiny. Before childbirth, women often turned to saints for protection. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular among expectant mothers. Legend claimed she could protect them during labor because she herself had once emerged unscathed from the belly of a dragon. Her prayers were recited, her image worn on tokens, her name whispered during contractions. Childbirth, in the eyes of the church, was tainted by sin thanks to the story of Eve. Women were told that pain in labor was punishment for humanity's original fall. So even in the most joyful moment, the birth of a child, a mother was reminded of her innate guilt. And if she died in childbirth without confession, she risked spiritual peril. Once the baby was born, baptism became the next urgent step. The fear of limbo was real if a child died before being baptized. Many believed their soul would be denied heaven. Midwives were sometimes authorized to perform emergency baptisms if a baby was too sick to wait for a priest. The idea of eternal damnation for a newborn was horrifying, but not uncommon in medieval theology. Superstition filled in where doctrine left gaps. Mothers tied charms to cradles, hung herbs above doorways, or drew protective symbols in ashes on the floor. The evil eye, malevolent fairies, and demonic spirits were all blamed for sickly babies or miscarriages. Some mothers whispered secret names for their children to confuse spirits who might come to steal them away. The church also had control over how women were reintegrated into society after birth. The churching ceremony, usually held about 40 days after delivery, was a kind of ritual purification. Until then, a mother was considered spiritually unclean and was expected to stay out of public worship. The ceremony was meant to bless and welcome her back, but it was also a subtle rebuke. Childbirth, though necessary, left a stain. Despite the harsh theology, many mothers found comfort in faith. Prayer was protection, ritual was reassurance, and hope lived somewhere between the Psalms and the pain. Once a child survived infancy, the next phase of medieval motherhood began, shaping a human who could survive in a brutal world. This meant discipline, hard truths, and often early separation. For peasant mothers, education wasn't about books, it was about survival skills. From the moment a child could walk, they were expected to contribute. Girls helped gather firewood, feed chickens, and carry water. Boys learned to tend animals, swing tools, and follow behind their fathers in the fields. Mothers were the first teachers, showing their children how to knead dough, spin wool, or patch a worn tunic. The lessons were practical, immediate, and passed down like heirlooms. Discipline was stern, but not necessarily cruel. In a world where disobedience could mean death, a wandering child might drown in a well or be kicked by a horse. Strictness was a form of love. Corporal punishment was common, but so were rewards. A warm meal, a kiss on the forehead, a song by the hearth. Affection and correction often went hand in hand. Among the nobility, education took a different shape. Boys were sent off to train as pages or squires, often before they turned 10. Girls were sometimes placed in convents or noble households to learn etiquette, embroidery, and the finer points of courtly behavior. For noble mothers, this meant letting go of their children early, sometimes never to raise them at all. That didn't mean they didn't care. Letters from noble women revealed deep concern for their children's health, marriages, and reputations. A noble mother might not talk Childen every night, but she was often behind the scenes, arranging their futures like a chess master. Still, the emotional toll of separation was real. Children might be raised by strangers, nursed by others, and married off by 15. A mother might hear of her child's death via messenger, or not at all. And yet, medieval mothers found ways to stay connected through prayers, keepsakes, and traditions. They passed down songs, names, and customs, embedding themselves in their children's lives, whether near or far. Medieval motherhood wasn't about holding on. It was about preparing to let go early, often, and without guarantee. Medieval mothers rarely left written records. They didn't pen diaries or publish books, but their fingerprints are everywhere, in the lullabies that survived, the traditions passed down, the prayers carved into chapel walls, and the bones of the children they raised against all odds. Their love didn't look like ours. There were no baby showers or ultrasound photos on the wall. Affection was quiet, practical, and often masked by the need to stay emotionally guarded. After all, when so many children died young, to love deeply was to risk devastation. And yet, mothers did love fiercely, patiently, and without pause. We find traces of that love in the margins of medieval texts, where a woman scribbled her lost child's name beside a prayer. In letters from queens begging for news of their children, in the battered shoes left on graves, and in folktales where mothers trade their lives for their children's safety. These weren't symbols of weakness. They were acts of defiance in a world constantly testing maternal strength. Loss was a constant companion. Stillbirths, fevers, plagues, war. A mother could raise 10 children and bury 6. Mourning was private, often silent, yet carried for a lifetime. Grief wasn't always spoken, but it was never absent. And still, they endured. They endured childbirth with no medicine. They endured the shame of barrenness and the pain of losing child after child. They endured the church's scrutiny, society's demands, and their own body's limits. Some endured violence from husbands. Others endured exile, poverty, or starvation. But through it all, they nurtured, protected, taught, and most miraculously, hoped. Their legacy isn't written in stone monuments, but in the generations that followed. They are the unnamed ancestors who fed us, clothed us, and somehow made it all work. They built the foundations of family and survival, even when the odds said they shouldn't have. Medieval motherhood wasn't saintly, and it wasn't soft. It was tough, complicated, heartbreaking, and brave. It was sometimes joyful, often tragic, always vital. In every sense, these women were the silent architects of the medieval world. And though history rarely carved their names into its walls, their labor shaped kingdoms, their choices molded futures, and their sacrifices echo in us long after the cradles were emptied and the prayers faded. Long before we ever glimpsed the moons of Jupiter or the rings of Saturn, humanity stared up at the night sky with wonder and very limited tools. In the pre-telescopic world, the cosmos was a vast, unreachable canvas. People tracked stars, plotted planets, and marked the seasons, but they did it all with the naked eye. And that eye, remarkable as it is, has limits. For most of human history, the sky was interpreted more than it was studied. Ancient cultures turned constellations into stories. Orion was a hunter, Scorpio a scorpion sent by the gods. The Greeks named wandering lights planets, wanderers, because they moved differently than fixed stars. But no one really knew what they were. Were they fiery chariots, crystal spheres, divine lanterns? No one had any way to look closer and find out. Observation meant standing under the stars and recording what could be seen. Tools like the astrolabe, developed by Islamic astronomers, helped track celestial motion with surprising precision. The Babylonians and Mayans kept meticulous calendars and predicted eclipses. The Greeks built complex mechanical devices like the Antikythera mechanism to calculate planetary positions. But no one could see beyond what the eye allowed, and that meant space remained more mystery than reality. The idea of magnifying vision was at best a curiosity. People understood reflection mirrors existed, but refraction, the bending of light through a lens, was still a misunderstood phenomenon. The science of optics was in its infancy, and no one had yet considered applying it to the stars. More importantly, no one imagined that the sky itself could change. The heavens were considered perfect, eternal, and unchanging. Aristotle's realm of divine order. The earth, by contrast, was corrupt and chaotic. This belief held back scientific progress for centuries. Why build a device to examine something you already believed to be flawless? And yet, the need was there. Buried in the questions humanity kept asking. What are the stars made of? Why do some lights move and others don't? Is Earth truly at the center of everything? All of those questions floated unanswered above a world that had no way to peer beyond its boundaries. No way until glassmakers, tinkerers, and one curious Dutchman changed everything. Long before anyone dreamed of peering into the stars, ancient people were already bending light, just not intentionally. In fact, the earliest lenses were likely accidents. Transparent crystals like quartz or beryl could naturally magnify objects when shaped just right. These stones, polished and rounded by hand or nature, would occasionally reveal something curious. Objects looked larger when seen through them. To our ancestors, it must have seemed like magic. By the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians had crafted what we now call the Nimrud lens, a piece of rock. Crystal possibly used to magnify or focus light. Its exact purpose is debated. Was it part of a scientific tool or just decorative? Regardless, it proves one thing. Humans had started to notice that light could be manipulated. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where reading stones appeared hemispherical pieces of glass placed directly on texts to enlarge the letters beneath. They were the precursors to magnifying glasses and a direct link in the evolutionary chain of optics. These tools didn't explore the sky, but they gave humanity a hint. Sight could be enhanced. Yet the real leap came not in Rome, but in the Islamic Golden Age. In the 10th and 11th centuries, a polymath named Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan, revolutionized the study of light. He wasn't building telescopes, but his work laid down the theory of how they would one day work. Al-Hazan conducted experiments with glass, mirrors, and water to understand how light traveled and bent. He proposed that vision wasn't descent out from the eyes, as many believed, but rather that light entered the eyes. An insight so obvious today, it's hard to believe it was once controversial. His book of optics laid out principles of refraction and reflection, defining the science of light centuries before Europe would rediscover it. Though these thinkers never applied their theories to the stars, they built the intellectual scaffolding needed for future inventors. Their writings, once translated into Latin, spread through medieval Europe, setting the stage for the explosive optical experimentation of the Renaissance. By the 13th century, the science of optics had quietly crept into everyday life, not through astronomy, but through a far more personal issue: bad eyesight. In the bustling workshops of Italy, particularly around Venice, glassmakers began crafting lenses to help aging monks and scholars read their manuscripts. The result: spectacles. The earliest spectacles appeared around 1285, likely in Pisa or Venice. They were simple convex lenses framed in wood or metal, designed to sit precariously on the nose. There were no temples or arms to hook behind the ears. Users simply pinched them into place or held them up by hand, but the effect was revolutionary. For the first time, people could fight back against fading vision. The popularity of reading glasses spread fast, especially among clergy and educated elites. Monks could now read scripture well into their later years. Scholars could pore over texts late into the night. Glassmakers had stumbled upon a booming industry, even though they didn't fully understand the physics behind what they were selling. Still, this new obsession with magnification planted an idea in the collective imagination. If glass could help us see the small, could it also help us see the distant? The leap wasn't immediate. For centuries, spectacle making remained a trade focused on individual needs, helping people see books and thread needles. But in the background, knowledge of convex and concave lenses slowly matured. Artisans began playing with lens shapes. Scholars copied and built upon old Arabic texts about refraction. Tinkering became more ambitious. The Renaissance, with its mania for rediscovery and reinvention, poured fuel on this fire. Experimenters began combining lenses, sometimes in play, sometimes in pursuit of genuine innovation. Eventually, someone stumbled upon a configuration that did something unexpected. It brought distant objects closer. That someone, according to most accounts, was Hans Lippershey, a Dutch spectacle maker who around 1608 assembled a device that could magnify faraway objects. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. His invention, a simple tube with two lenses, was dubbed the spyglass. It had the power to change warfare, navigation, and soon, the cosmos. But Lippershey wouldn't he be the one to turn it to the stars that would take a different kind of mind? Part scientist, part showman, and entirely unafraid to challenge the heavens. When news of Hans Lippershey's spyglass reached Italy, one man saw something others didn't away to challenge the very fabric of the cosmos. That man was Galileo Galilei, a mathematics professor from Pisa with a flair for experimentation and a deep skepticism toward accepted truths. Upon hearing of the Dutch device in 1609, he didn't just want to copy it. He wanted to improve it. Within months, he built his own telescope, first a 3X magnification, then an 8X, and soon after a 20X. Compared to Lippershey's clunky tool, Galileo's telescope was sharper, longer, and more refined. Then he pointed it at the sky. The moment was historic. Through his handmade lenses, Galileo became the first human to truly see the heavens. What he found shattered the delicate divine perfection taught by Aristotle and defended by the Church. The moon, for instance, was not a smooth, glowing sphere. Galileo saw craters and mountains in perfection. The Milky Way wasn't a milky smear. It was made up of countless stars. Jupiter, thought to be just another wandering light, had moons, 4 of them, orbiting the planet like tiny celestial satellites. He named them the Medicean stars after his patrons, but we know them today as the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And most shocking of all, Venus had phases just like the moon, proving it orbited the sun, not Earth. With each observation, Galileo drove a dagger into the heart of the old geocentric model. The Earth, it seemed, was not the center of everything. The universe was bigger, stranger, and more dynamic than anyone had imagined. Galileo published his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in 1610. It was a sensation, a celestial tell-all. Crowds gathered to see his telescope. Scholars praised him. The Church grew uneasy because this wasn't just a scientific tool anymore. The telescope had become dangerous. It offered evidence that contradicted centuries of theological doctrine. The heavens, once thought immutable and divine, now looked messy, changing, and full of motion. Galileo hadn't just invented astronomy. He had weaponized vision. And with a few polished lenses, he had started a war between observation and belief. The stars would never be safe or silent again. Galileo had proven what two lenses in a tube could do, but his Galilean design, one convex lens at the front, one concave at the eyepiece, had limits. A narrow field of view, blurry edges, and poor magnification once pushed beyond 30x. Enter Johannes Kepler, the German mathematician already famous for his laws of planetary motion. Reading the Starry Messenger in 1610, Kepler asked a simple question: could the optics be better? Within a year, he produced Dioptris, a treatise that rewrote the rule book of lenses. Kepler proposed swapping Galileo's concave eyepiece for a second convex lens. The image would flip upside down, but the payoff was huge. A wider field, sharper focus, and theoretically unlimited magnification. Kepler himself never built the device. He spent his life juggling patronage, plague, and family tragedy. But his blueprint spread across Europe like contraband. Tinkerers seized on the idea. In Italy, Francesco Fontana crafted long, unwieldy instruments, some stretching 6 meters, claiming 160x power. In the Netherlands, Christian Huygens and his brother later pushed the length past 30 meters to hunt for Saturn's rings. The first verified Keplerian telescopes appeared in the 1630s, likely built by Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner. He demonstrated one to the emperor in Vienna, dazzling courtiers with right-angled spies on distant church spires, albeit all upside down. The inverted view was a small price to pay for clarity, yet it created a new market. Erecting eyepieces and clever mirror diagonals were developed for land-based viewing. Artisans in Paris and London competed to sell astronomical versus terrestrial models. Telescopes were no longer scientific curiosities. They were luxury items for nobles who wanted to brag about seeing ships before they reached harbor. Meanwhile, Kepler's optics ignited serious science. With clearer images, astronomers could sketch sunspots, map lunar valleys, and time Jupiter's moons so precisely that they proposed using them as celestial clocks for longitude. The telescope was evolving from a disruptive gadget into an indispensable instrument. Yet every added inch of focal length made tubes sag and glass blur. The race was on for shorter telescopes with longer power. That challenge would summon a genius who hated chromatic smears and loved Apple's one, Isaac Newton. The arms race of vision was far from over. It was only changing shape. By the mid-1600s, the refracting telescope had stretched to absurd proportions in pursuit of better magnification. Astronomers were building scopes longer than houses, some over 100 feet long, just to tame a frustrating flock-chromatic aberration. This was the rainbow-colored smudge that bled around bright objects. As light passed through curved lenses, colors split like a prism, creating blurry halos. No matter how carefully a lens was shaped, the colors refused to behave. Enter Isaac Newton, a man who not only understood the problem, but also refused to tolerate it. Already famed for calculus and gravity, Newton turned his razor-sharp intellect to optics. His solution? Stop using lenses altogether. In 1668, Newton introduced something radical: the reflecting telescope. Instead of bending light through glass, he used a curved mirror to collect and focus it. Mirrors didn't split light into rainbows. They didn't need to be hundreds of feet long. And best of all, they could be short, powerful, and precise. Newton's design used a concave primary mirror at the bottom of the tube, which reflected light to a flat diagonal mirror, then into the eyepiece mounted on the side. It looked nothing like Galileo's spyglass, but it worked. The image was crisp, clear, and most importantly, free of color distortion. At first, Newton kept his invention quiet. He wasn't a fan of public drama. But by 1672, he presented the telescope to the Royal Society, and it caused a stir. Here was a compact instrument with better performance than refractors many times its size. Observers could now study Jupiter's belts, Saturn's rings, and the rugged lunar surface with stunning detail, and from a backyard, not a cathedral rooftop. Still, the reflecting telescope came with its own challenges. Making a perfectly parabolic mirror was difficult. Early versions used polished metal, which tarnished quickly and had to be repolished constantly. But the core idea was revolutionary, and its potential undeniable. Newton's invention didn't replace refractors overnight, but it cracked the telescope wide open. Astronomers now had two competing paths, lenses or mirrors. And as mirror technology improved, Newton's quiet rebellion would reshape the very architecture of astronomy. The universe hadn't changed, but the way we saw it just took a leap forward. By the 18th century, telescopes had escaped the hands of individual tinkerers and entered the age of national pride, royal funding, and scientific ambition. The telescope was no longer just a clever invention. It was a weapon in the battle to understand the universe. Across Europe, astronomers wielded it like never before. One towered above this era, William Herschel. A German-born musician turned self-taught astronomer, Herschel moved to England and became obsessed with the night sky. With the help of his brilliant sister, Caroline Herschel, he began building massive reflecting telescopes in his backyard, melting metal, casting mirrors, and grinding lenses by hand. One of his designs reached over 40 feet long, with a 4-foot-wide mirror. It was the largest telescope in the world at the time. With it, he made history. In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus, the first new planet found since ancient times. It shook the foundations of astronomy. Suddenly, the solar system was bigger than anyone had imagined. Herschel didn't stop there. He charted thousands of stars, cataloged nebulae, and coined the term galaxy. He speculated that some of the fuzzy clouds seen through his telescope might be entire island universes, far beyond our own. Caroline, meanwhile, became a respected astronomer in her own right. She discovered several comets, refined star charts, and published groundbreaking catalogs, working tirelessly beside her brother in the observatory. Elsewhere, the telescope was also helping scientists crack long-standing puzzles. Astronomers used it to track transits of Venus, calculating Earth's distance from the Sun. Telescopic measurements improved celestial navigation, allowing ships to traverse oceans with far greater precision. Naval empires quite literally depended on the sky. While Newton's reflectors remained elite instruments, achromatic refractors, which reduced chromatic aberration using special lens combinations, were now commercially available. Opticians like John Dowland refined lenses to sharpen the image without the rainbow smears, offering the best of both worlds, clarity and color correction. Observatories were being built across Europe, Paris, Berlin, Greenwich. Astronomy became institutionalized. Telescopes sat not just in scholars' attics, but in towers, domes, and royal estates. They had become symbols of enlightenment and empire. This was the golden age of stargazing, when the telescope wasn't just expanding our view, but our very place in the cosmos. As the 19th century dawned, the telescope entered its industrial phase. What began as handmade tubes of brass and glass now became precision-engineered instruments of steel, bronze, and cast iron. The sky once mapped by candlelight was now being charted by the rising might of factories, railroads, and empire. The biggest shift? Size. Telescopes were getting enormous. In Ireland, a wealthy astronomer named William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, constructed what was then the largest telescope on Earth. Completed in 1845, the Leviathan of Parsonstown boasted a mere 6 feet in diameter and a tube 50 feet long, suspended between two massive masonry walls. It looked more like a siege weapon than a scientific instrument, but it worked. With it, Parsons observed the swirling structure of what was then called the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51. He made one of the first sketches resembling a spiral galaxy. He had no way of knowing how far away it truly was, but the drawing alone hinted that the universe might be full of systems like our own, far beyond the Milky Way. Meanwhile, other observatories sprang up in France, Russia, and America. Astronomers were no longer lone geniuses in cloaks, but salaried researchers with assistants, budgets, and government grants. Telescopes began moving westward toward drier air, clearer skies, and higher altitudes. One of the most famous was the Lick Observatory in California, built atop Mount Hamilton in 1888. It housed the largest refracting telescope ever constructed, with a 36-inch objective lens. Not to be outdone, the Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin followed in 1897 with an even longer refractor, still the biggest of its kind to this day. But refractors were nearing their limit. Lenses sagged under their own weight. Glass this big couldn't be perfectly cast or supported. The future once again pointed to mirrors. Engineers began experimenting with silver-coated glass lighter and easier to maintain than Newton's old metal mirrors. Reflectors, once overshadowed by their lens-based cousins, were making a comeback. At the same time, photography entered the equation for the first time. Telescopes weren't just for viewing the heavens. They could record them. Astronomers began capturing long-exposure images of stars, nebulae, and planets, seeing deeper than ever before. The age of observation was ending. The age of data had begun. As the 20th century unfolded, the telescope transformed from a tool of vision into a machine of revelation. No longer limited to what the eye could see, telescopes began collecting data across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Unlocking secrets visible light had always hidden from us. The revolution began atop Mount Wilson in California, where George Ellery Hawley spearheaded the creation of the Hooker telescope, completed in 1917. With a 100-inch mirror, it was the most powerful telescope of its time. Into that mirror stared a young astronomer named Edwin Hubble. In the 1920s, Hubble used the Hooker to peer into the Andromeda Nebula. What he discovered changed everything. Andromeda wasn't a cloud within our galaxy. It was a galaxy itself, one of millions. Hubble's work demolished the idea of a small, static universe. The cosmos, it turned out, was vast, expanding, and ancient beyond measure. Soon, even the atmosphere became a limitation. Earth's air blurred starlight and blocked much of the electromagnetic spectrum. So in the latter half of the century, telescopes began climbing higher into balloons, planes, and eventually orbit. In 1990, NASA launched the Hubble Space Telescope, a namesake tribute, orbiting above Earth's distorted atmosphere. After an initial hiccup with its mirror, Hubble went on to deliver the most detailed images of the universe ever captured: pillars of gas, dying stars, infant galaxies. It stared deeper into time than any human eye ever had. And Hubble was just the beginning. Radio telescopes like those at Arecibo and the Very Large Array in New Mexico allowed scientists to listen to space. Infrared telescopes revealed cool, hidden objects cloaked in cosmic dust. X-ray telescopes detected black holes devouring matter. Each new type of telescope revealed a new layer of the cosmos. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021. Far more sensitive than Hubble, designed to look back over 13 billion years to the dawn of galaxy formation. Not just an eye in the sky, but a time machine built of gold mirrors and deep mathematics. From Galileo's shaky wooden tube to spacefaring observatories cooled by liquid helium, the telescope has evolved into an instrument of pure awe. We no longer just see the universe. We decode it. And with each new lens, mirror, or frequency unlocked, we inch closer to answering the question that started it all. What else is out there?